where innovation goes tomorrow. Just to set some context before I introduce the panelists, I'll go over some facts. Some of them may be provocative, others may be just general knowledge, but just to reestablish a baseline for all of us. Research spending over the last 30 or so years, since 1982 through 2009, has gone up in the US from $10 billion to approximately $140 billion. This is a growth rate of 4 to 5%. So research spending has grown. The number of medical research papers and patents that have been published since 1965 have also grown at an incredible rate, correlated with the amount of research dollars that are going into this space. Pharma spending has gone up from a few $billion in the 60s to about $60 billion today. However, the number of new molecular entities that come to market has remained pretty consistent over that time, between 30 and 35 new molecular entities every year. And if the conversation takes us there today, we'll talk about what are the right outcome measures, whether it's actually a new molecular entity, if it's a number of patents, if it's new research that's commissioned, and how do we really look at this moving forward. There was a recent study by IBM that proposed, using statistically valid samples, that the types of partnership models that academia and biotech have with large pharma companies directly influence the return on invested capital as well as sales of those drugs. So there is a legitimate discussion about how we partner with each other and what types of partnerships make innovation successful. We do know that there is little to no transparency or oversight in terms of the dollars that exist in the U.S. medical system. We're expending about $140 billion today, as I said. It's unclear if there's any one source that knows where the $140 billion are going and what type of research those dollars are invoking and where that work is being done and what the outcome of that work is. Lisa will talk a little bit about what other countries are doing to actually provide that oversight and transparency so that we are reducing the amount of overlap in research and so that there is a focus on outcomes. There's also recently been a lot of press from the Atlantic Monthly to Newsweek to Nature magazine around this notion of scientists behaving badly, and this goes to the allocation of capital. And this is not my title. This was the title of a paper in Nature magazine called "Scientists Behaving Badly." And so there's a question about what are the systems that we have today, and what are the incentives that are driving the behaviors that exist in the system today to advance innovation or to preclude it. And finally, as among many other notions that we'll cover today is the distinction between large diseases that are driving 70 or 80% of the cost in the system and the dollars that are being allocated towards those and the efficiency of those dollars versus smaller, generally neglected orphan diseases and the role of philanthropic capital over the last 10 or 15 years and how that's really advanced the dialogue in those spaces. 3% of the dollars in research today are now being funded by philanthropic organizations that are tremendously advanced where research in these specific disease areas is. So these are some of the concepts that we hope we can discuss over the next 45 minutes. Quickly, I'll introduce this illustrious panel. To my right here is Mark Simon, and I'll ask the panel to perhaps use 30 seconds to introduce themselves, as well as answer an opening question that I'll pose to the panel. Their bios do exist in the book, so I think the detailed bios you guys have either gone over. I'm sure you know most of these people anyway. Lisa Mitchell from the Kauffman Foundation, Susan Axelrod, and Dennis Purcell. This is a representation, again of private sector, of public sector, civil society, so it should be an incredible panel. The opening question really is, and as you guys introduce yourself briefly, perhaps a few opening thoughts around the opening question to frame the conversation is this really about resources or capital, or is it about resource allocation? Is it that we don't have sufficient dollars, or is it that we're not using those dollars appropriately? Or is it both? And if you put in a disease area focus and think about where the dollars are actually going, versus where they should be going, I think it brings up, it's a different framework of asking the same question. Is it about capital or is it about capital allocation? Mark, perhaps you could start from the right.
Sure. My name is Mark Simon. I joined a Wall Street firm 27 years ago. I've been on the research side, the banking side, on the industry side, and now I specialize in business development deals. And I actually wanted to start off with what I think is some good news, which is on the rare diseases. It used to be, when I was on Wall Street, that if you had a product for a rare disease or a clinical candidate, you had three places to go. You can go to Genzyme, you can go to BioMarin, and then Shire. And Shire was more in the last 5 or 10 years, not when the company was founded. I think one of the pieces of good news that's happened is thanks to Genzyme's success with its three main products, Fabrazyme, Myozyme, and Cerezyme. Those have sold, been very successful blockbusters, sold way above expectations. I was involved in the in the Genzyme IPO back in 1986, so I actually built the first model for Ceridase. That was the placental-derived material. And we thought there were a couple hundred patients with Gaucher's who might use the drug. And every quarter, there was more and more patients, every quarter more and more sales. And eventually it plateaued at about $1.1 billion, but for 10 or 12 years, the sales kept on growing and more patients came out. And obviously, some of the early estimates were wrong. People said, oh, this is a tiny product. Maybe it'll sell $100 million a year. Nobody will use it. It's got an unfriendly delivery system, etc. Well, it turns out that's kind of electrified the space. A company I'm involved with Alex Barkas, Amicus Therapeutics, had competitive products to Genzyme. They were successful in finding a deal with Shire. One of the molecules didn't work, so the assumption was, well, once you have a failure with an important player in the space, that puts you in the penalty box. But yet the company recently did a successful deal with GlaxoSmithKline. So here's a company that had a failed collaboration, and yet they found a new home shortly afterwards for one of its products. Pfizer, as you know, came into the space with a collaboration in the Gaucher space. So in my 27 years and in my BD activities, I've never seen more companies ask about rare diseases. What do you got there? I recently went to Japan and I met with 12 companies, and 5 of them asked about rare diseases. It's a bit of a herd mentality, which is if Pfizer decides to go into one, everybody follows, and that's one of the problems in the industry, is if there's one target, then all of a sudden, and one molecule, there's 20. So everybody focuses on kind of the same validated, like PI3 kinase is an example of, quote, a hot target 5 years ago. Now there's 25 of them. Do we need 25 of them? No. Is it a waste? Is it a lot of wasted resources? Yes, in terms of your question. But the problem is the culture in big pharma and in some of the smaller pharma companies, spec pharma, is that if one target is hot, the head of R&D or the CEO said, we have to have a program in the space. So now you get 25 of them. And frankly, of the 25, maybe 2 or 3 will make it, so 22 are wasted. But nevertheless, because one is in it, everybody has to be in it. So I want to close by just saying on the rare disease space, I've never seen more companies interested in this space. I think the business model is there. And as Art Levinson of Genentech said, many products that you think address small diseases, rare diseases, small populations like Rituxan and Herceptin end up selling, multi-billion dollars. No one thought when EPO was approved by the FDA in June of '89 as an orphan drug for patients on dialysis to replace transfusions, that today we'd be talking about $10 billion in sales. And in fact, if you look at the top 15 products today, probably 8 of them were perceived to be orphan when they were launched, and now they're the mega blockbusters. So I think that notion that you can't really tell, and that if the science is good, and if you know that you're perturbing a target in the body, and that's resulting in a medical benefit, a clinical benefit, and you can show that in a rare disease, that you might have a fairly good chance of expanding that. And that's been the model for Herceptin, Avastin, Rituxan. And in the case of Cerezyme, they didn't expand the indications, the people, the incidence, the prevalence ended up being much bigger. That's something else you can't tell. So the data, epidemiology data in terms of how many people have this disease has proven not to be that accurate. And usually it's a lot more and not a lot less.
Right. Lisa,
That was a long 30 seconds.
Yes. That's my piece.
Okay, I'll do 10.
I'll take
I'll
30
make
minutes.
up
seconds
for it,
is just
Dennis.
fine.
I'll
Is
make
the
up.
panel over or not?
I saw your notes.
On that
He
note,
only has 2 things written
that was the wrap up
I took
actually.
his main thing, exactly.
So Lisa, dollars have gone up, productivity has declined. What's going on? With your introduction, of course.
Okay, so I'm Lisa Mitchell with the Kauffman Foundation. We are the Foundation of Entrepreneurship and fund the majority of research on the topic of innovation and entrepreneurship around the world. And I would love to have a longitudinal study to figure out who are the herders, the people who fund the science or the venture guys.
Ask Dennis.
And it's interesting. Bob Cook-Deegan said to me, and I don't think he's here, he said to me once, unfortunately in science, and I'm thinking about the articles that you were just talking about, sometimes we don't know what we don't know when we don't know it.
Yep.
And if we were to know everything we know now, 10 or 12 years ago, when we increased the funding of the NIH, we would probably do everything differently. We'd build big data sets, we'd have data standards, we'd do kind of all of those things. And I mean, what we know, especially in kind of the space of new industry and entrepreneurship in the US, is that sometimes it's not good. I mean, we're finding that in energy now. It's not good to be on the bleeding edge. We've already got all this infrastructure built, and so finding these new models kind of sucks sometimes. And it's better to do it in India and China because they don't have some of the infrastructure in place. Well, the same applies kind of in energy as it does in life science. And people in other countries have looked at what we have done and said, I'm not going to do that. The examples being, in China, where they literally map everything that the government funds. And so you can figure out who is funded for what, where, know where the overlaps, know where the holes are, et cetera. I don't think we know that in this country, and it's kind of hard to do it, unfortunately, in retrospect. So I think, as you heard, the panel previous to this was awesome. It was great to hear Ben Shapiro, a for-profit guy, talking about open source and how we're going to manage, pre-competitive work. And unfortunately, it smacks in the face of, the venture guys. I think people have always looked at you venture guys and said, oh no, it's because of them that we have to have this hardcore IP, which is baloney. You're just looking to build your for-profit model.
Speak for yourself.
Okay, good, let's argue. But we know, and I think, it is the disease philanthropist, but frankly, it's also getting a lot of really smart people like Warren, who built the Janus Fund and is now into the philanthropic world, and Susan, who's now into the philanthropic world, and obviously Mike Milken, et cetera. I think it's not just the disease or the rare disease space, but it's getting really smart people who understand for-profit models into this philanthropic space that are doing, Bob Beal led the world in the early venture philanthropy and helped us figure out what this space looks like. So I think we have, I don't think, and we have the data to support this, and Bill from Warburg Pincus just sent me a new data set that he put together, and it supports everything that we have been saying. There is no shortage of money. There is a huge misallocation of money. And yes, Dennis, we can totally argue about this all day.
Get ready.
And what I'm saying that, I'm saying it both on the funding side,
Right.
relative to, we hosted a meeting for Peggy Hamburg and Francis Collins, and my favorite guy, Chris Austin, in July. And Francis said, we can't make these changes ourselves. We need you guys to be kind of hardcore, both the philanthropic people as well as others, because, unfortunately, and he didn't say this, I'm saying this, you have Congress and Senate that are out there all vying for funding for their own state, institutions, et cetera. And so we normalize all of the funding across everywhere and don't get anything done. And so, they've inherited this model that we have to figure out how to overcome. So there are a multitude of issues in the philanthropic space, the science space, and the for-profit venture funding space, but I still say it's all, we need to reallocate dollars.
Right. So, Susan, you're representing this trend that I think is a powerful trend over the last 15 or 20 years, and it really has been a boon for public health, which is patient advocacy groups and philanthropic organizations coming in and consolidating the patient point of view, also raising dollars to advance research in areas that have historically been underfunded. What is the state of philanthropic capital today? And perhaps I'll also ask you to touch on a concept that we had started discussing, which was size. And taking Lisa's point into account, we have the opportunity to build the systems of tomorrow today, and yet there's a size and scale which organizations reach, at which point they start to become much less flexible. And this is true of patient advocacy groups as well. So the emerging fragmentation, different points of views, the size of these organizations, and so the reason to exist changes over the course of time. So perhaps if you can shed some light on these topics as you introduce yourself as well.
I will try. I'm the one person on this panel who doesn't know all the jargon that's being thrown around here, so bear with me. Osama and I had a prep call, and he said I represent civil society, and I had to email him afterwards and say, not sure what that means, and what does it mean about my other panelists?
That was an even better question.
That's a good one. Excellent.
But I actually, my bio's in there, but I got engaged in this field not by choice, but because I have a daughter with epilepsy, and I'm very epilepsy-centric in my knowledge and my passion. But I actually was thinking about it, and I think that I am a clinical researcher for the last 30 years. My N is only 1, but I had to put my daughter through drug trials. Over 20 different drugs failed to control her seizures. 2 different attempts with ketogenic diet, vagal nerve stimulation, evaluations for brain surgery, and all that time, sort of unbeknownst to me, I'm collecting data, but only on her, and sort of recognizing many years into this, why on earth, in this particular disease space, it's been known since biblical times, do we not have an answer for how to stop seizures? And for those of you who don't know, sorry, I'm a little bit on my soapbox, but it can damage the brain, particularly when it starts in young children, and be fatal. So very serious problem that I started to sort of look at. And when I first began to look in the space, looked at the NIH budget and saw that it just seemed woefully low, just in terms of total dollars committed to epilepsy, especially within the NINDS, where it is one of the most common disorders. Digging a little bit deeper, so my initial impression was we just have to have more dollars. And I think as I got into it and started to get a little more sophisticated in my understanding of research, and started to realize, first of all, I think the importance that patient groups like mine and like Epilepsy Therapy Development Project can bring to it, sort of things that they weren't even looking at in terms of the comorbidities. We just last week we're a part of a conference that we funded with Autism Speaks, because there is so much interplay between those 2 diseases. And I think nobody really was looking at that. 30 to 40% of kids with autism develop epilepsy. So, whether we can come together and some infrastructure and some projects there. So as I have delved into the field more, I would agree that it's really resource allocation. We want to really be focused in the epilepsy space on making sure that we're dividing and conquering, because there are numerous philanthropic groups out there. Warren's group, we're mentioning Warren quite a bit, is on one end of the continuum. Our focus has really been on the basic research, because one of the things I think that we also brought to bear on the research agenda was that the focus was not on disease modifying, but more on symptom control. So this is why my daughter failed 20 different drugs. Nobody was looking at sort of rational therapies. And I'm not sure if I answered your other questions. But,
I think you've brought up a lot of new interesting concepts that we'll continue talking about. Steve, with your introduction, oh no, sorry, Dennis. I'm sorry.
Do I look like
It
a
was
Steve?
no, it was the microphone. It did, yeah. So Dennis, as you introduce yourself, if you can also talk about, we started talking about this yesterday, both in terms of capital and allocation of capital. You mentioned this gap between the supply of capital and the demand of capital, and it's unmatched today. It perhaps always has been, but even more so today, which raises the question of how we raise capital moving forward and how we allocate it.
Great. Couple introductory remarks. You guys are great. Lisa and David's a great. Thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you.
And I have a kind of a good news, bad news. The good news is that given that Mark Simon's worked for 27 years in the industry, I must be younger than him. I feel good. The bad news with Alex Barkas and Jim Blair out, and they always argue with me, so I don't know what to say. We have a venture capital firm. We manage about $2 billion, based in New York. It's called Aislinn Capital, devoted to the life sciences field. And kind of somewhat to your question, I would beg to differ a little bit. I mean, this isn't, and people don't like to hear this, but we have not given returns to this industry. And the people
Agree.
No, and Alex and Jim and I, and in a certain sense, we're intermediaries. We take money from cities, universities, states, and we have to figure out in this industry how to give money back. And we've done we've done a very poor job interacting with patient groups. You guys don't know what we do. We don't know what you do. And somehow we have to figure out a way to kind of bring that together, because particularly in an era where the FDA is so conservative and reimbursement is so tough. And, Mark, I take your point. I agree with your points. We need to figure out a way to collaborate better with the not-for-profit and the for-profits. I think we're talking past each other right now.
And Dennis, if you could continue, and if I stay with you, I'm sorry. Let me just make one last point. And Alex or Jim chime in. I mean, the people that are limited partners, the issue that we have is they want their capital back fast. Right. And that's the point that I wanted to drive a little bit more.
Okay. Yeah. And this is not an industry that gets capital back fast.
Fast, by the way, means 5 to 10 years instead of 10 to 20 years.
I would argue 2 to 5, but this is the challenge we face, which is we would love to fund innovation, we'd love to fund this stuff. I'm all for it, but we have pressures. With the state of California being where they are, or the city of New York being where they are, they want capital back faster, and we need to figure out a new model to help get capital back a little bit faster.
But ultimately, it's driven by the productivity and the ROI question, right? I mean, to your point, the return on invested capital in this space has been declining, and it's pretty abysmal now, which I think has accelerated the fears of the investors, which in turn has accelerated the time for payback that they want. So it's now down to 2 to 5 years when it may take 10 to 12 years to develop a compound. If there were returns that were consistent that your investors were seeing, I think the conversation dialogue could be different. So
totally different. Totally.
So how do we?
This is people want to fund epilepsy. People want to fund this. Everybody's mother has breast cancer. Everybody's father has prostate cancer. People want to fund this industry. Our job, and we've done, when I say we collectively, relatively poor job over the last decade. I don't know, Alex, if you agree or disagree.
There are lots of structural reasons why this hasn't been as rewarding in the last decade as it was in the previous decade. Venture in general, healthcare venture more specifically, and I think when people say we've stopped funding early stage or preclinical kinds of drug discovery efforts and so on, the answer is yeah, because for the most part, in the last decade, you didn't get rewarded for having done that.
Right.
And so the question is, are there any models in which you can do that? And if not, who's going to do it? And, I do think there's a role, obviously, for all the groups that are involved here to play a part in that. But it's not because we don't like it.
Yeah.
And
please.
it's not, your employer talks out of both sides of their mouth. You like us because of innovation and, Jim and everybody, doing innovation. On the other hand, you don't pay us for it. And everything's an earn out and everything's 5 years down the road. And, there's a disconnect here. And obviously the public markets don't like this business anymore either. But
no one's paying us.
no one's paying us, no one's paying us.
Yeah.
Poor VCs.
So just
Here, hey. By the way, just so
way
you
more
know,
interesting than I thought it would be.
I saw
this is one of the deans of the. This
Yeah.
is the dean of the biotech business right here, Jim Blair, and he's done so much for the industry over a long period of time. And Jim, I'd just like to say thank you for that.
Yeah. So just
Lisa.
a question for you, Dennis, and probably for you, Mark. So we held a meeting last year that Duncan Nader hosted for us, and Bill Hambrick and myself and Antoinette Shore sat on a panel, and Antoinette Shore is the woman with Josh Lerner that we funded to do essentially all of the research in this space. And Bill said, and we've got this on video on our website.
Bill
that-
H. Bill
Yes. And Bill said he did not believe, looking at the returns over time, that in the energy space or even in the life science space, that you could do funding like we do it now. That it had to be an evergreen fund or it wouldn't work. And Antoinette Shore said, quote unquote, if you are in the life science or energy space, you are playing the lottery. So I think obviously for us, the message as a GP also has been, as we've pulled the layers off, we see the people that work in the IT space, Madrona, et cetera, these guys are still making money. And they will make money because there's a shorter cycle time. So I completely agree with your point of, we have this kind of confluence of unfortunately the perfect bad storm, which is our cycle times are really long and seeming to get longer. We are going to more of a personalized medicine model, which isn't going to be the blockbuster drugs. And the only good news in the room seems to be venture philanthropy that can do some of the de-risking. But I think the real good news is the kinds of stuff that was talked about in the panel earlier this morning and that Stephen Friend is talking about in the breakout session that they're in right now, which is kind of getting back to, can we really understand the data? And so when we are doing drug development, we can go a hell of a lot faster.
So what is the profile of these?
It brings back a sad memory when you mentioned Bill Hambrick, because I worked for Hambrick and Quist, and I competed against Mark for 15 years, and he used to beat me 9 times out of 10. So it's bad.
I had pictures.
So for you, Lisa and Dennis, what is the profile of these cool new investors that are willing to go evergreen versus the traditional model, right? We were talking yesterday, and Dennis can't come up with any.
So there's one.
Society.
Yeah, there's
Royal Society.
Yeah, so Andrew and Herman and what they're doing over there. But essentially, I mean, I would call it, a version of for-profit philanthropy. I mean, these guys are committed to putting their own money in. So it's not other people's money, it's their own money, but it's an evergreen fund. And I can also tell you that they're still in the space of funding, kind of physics versus life science. And so we really haven't proven it out, but we've had many of these discussions with our investment committee that we need to create, and this is totally wrong terminology, but we're thinking about Black Swan as in the movie, or as in the book, that we kind of need to create the new funding model that's going to grow companies versus exit. How do we put money in play that can help to scale to the next level?
Right. How many people have 10-year horizons?
Yeah.
I mean, I hear
No,
you. I
absolutely.
love it.
I
mean,
agree.
I take that money all day long.
Yeah.
I go try to find it. I just can't
Yeah.
find it.
Yeah. Well, but is
to
the other...
Alex's point, I mean, our limiteds want their money back faster.
Yeah, but can I ask you two the other question of, it would seem to me, and the numbers play out in this slide deck I was looking at from Bill yesterday, there are a significant number of venture firms in this space, almost like back in the early 90s. But a lot of them are not real venture guys. and don't really have experience. And I think they're crowding out good money. And I know you guys agree with me, and you.
Stop dumping on me.
So the models are broken across the board, whether it's venture, whether it's pharma, whether it's academia. I think the general consensus I'm picking up here is there may be some capital issues, but there are a lot of capital allocation, resource allocation issues. So let's focus a little bit of time talking about what is broken across these significant stakeholder groups, whether it's the government, the research that they fund, whether it's academia and how research happens there, whether it's how VCs deploying their money, the advent of philanthropic dollars and how that's accelerated research in certain areas, some of the work that you may be doing, Lisa, to try and bridge the divide between these institutions to create transparency, rethink IP, really focus the conversation around proof of concept as opposed to the establishment of foundational knowledge in specific biology areas. Maybe if we can level set on the 2 or 3 things that are absolutely fundamentally broken from a process, incentive, perspective, and then some models that are emerging that are hopes for the future, and then how do we scale those models, which is the big issue.
I'll start off with the FDA, and I'll say the following comment. I've observed it now for my 27 years. And when Mark McClellan became FDA commissioner, he was President Bush's selection, he was terrific. He made the FDA predictable. The FDA worked. Drugs got through. He took the view that if you hold back a drug and that could help somebody, that's a harm. The pendulum was in the right place for this industry. The pendulum is now flung so far to the safety side that it really has become Russian roulette. As Dennis knows with the obesity companies, 3 of them went to the FDA. It's been complete Russian roulette. No one really has a clue what's going on. So if you're an investor and you're looking at multiple phase 3 trials and you hire the best consultants, and they're available, now maybe harder now with the SEC scandal, but certainly last year, or I should say a few months ago, you could hire medical consultants, and they would give you a very good opinion. Now they're going to go to jail or get arrested. But you really felt that you can get an edge because the data was all public and you can analyze it. And they did. And yet it went to the FDA advisory panel, and it was complete Russian roulette. No one had a clue. Then you have Alkermes and Amylin and Lilly with their Byetta, with their extended release formulation. Multiple clinical trials, thousands of patients. The original molecule is a twice-a-day injectable. So here you're going from a twice-a-day injectable to a once-a-week. Again, all the data is public. Everybody analyzes this. It gets turned down. The stock goes from 20 to 10. This causes capital and money to flee. When Mark McClellan ran, I'm a history major. I have no idea how I got into biotech, but nevertheless. The FDA worked for the brief 2 years that he was commissioner. The problem was he was so good that President Bush moved him out to run the Medicare prescription drug plan, which, by the way, has also been a spectacular success. My grandma's 101. She takes 18 pills a day. She never complains now about her bills. So the idea of going to Canada, on a bus, in protest, that's totally gone. But nevertheless, the FDA is something that has worked in the past. It has been predictable. And when the FDA works, the discount rate or the hurdle rates go down. So right now, if you're looking at making an investment in this industry, and if you get to phase 3, which most don't, and if you happen to file for approval, you now have to say there's only a 1 in 3 chance of getting through. Whereas 10 years ago, if you filed for approval and you had pretty good data, it was maybe 3 out of 4. And to fail in phase 3, or to fail at the FDA after hundreds of millions of dollars, or as Al Mann would say with Mankind, $1 billion, that's a catastrophe for all of us.
The 3 obesity companies have spent $3 billion, and we woke up in the morning of the meeting not having any idea what the FDA was going to do after $3 billion.
So that's something that we can fix. That's something that the American people need to fix. It's ridiculous. There's a lot of reasons for it. It has been fixed. The FDA has worked. It has been predictable. But the pendulum has now swung so far that it's actually impeding any reasonable drug from getting through. And with this Russian roulette, why would anybody invest in obesity? It's a scourge. It's an epidemic. We know how bad it is. Why would anybody put $1 into obesity based on what just happened?
So I think that's a terrific point to consider, which is related to regulatory science, and Peggy Hamburg talked about it yesterday and what the future models are. But is it just that, right? Is it just regulatory science that's precluding us from developing more than 30 NMEs a year when there's a ton of new money that's going on the research side? So how do we connect this back to basic research, getting proof of concepts, and actually developing things that have much better evidence earlier on, so that we can work with the FDA to create the new regulatory science to get this to market?
It's not regulatory science. It's,
Yeah, I
it's,
don't think
it's
it is either.
political will.
Yeah.
Well, whatever the right catchphrase of the day is.
But I worry that I completely agree. I mean, we know relative to entrepreneurship and economic growth, there's only one thing that matters, and that's reducing uncertainty. That's all that matters.
Across the board.
Across the board,
not just phase
reducing
3 approvals.
No, I mean across the board, reducing uncertainty in policy is what is going to change economic growth in this country. It impacts in a huge way, and there are big entrepreneurs, Tom Fogarty, others, our friends, who have all said we are not starting another company in the United States in this space because we know we can't even try with the FDA. So I'm with him. I mean, if I had a chit to use.
That's the thing. It's fixable.
Yeah.
You can't fix Alzheimer's. I mean, you can't
Yeah.
debug what's happening in the brain. You know, if you're Sony, you can pretty much fix anything because it's man-made.
Yeah.
But the FDA, we created it,
Yeah.
and we pay for it, so we should at least get some returns.
Yeah.
We
I'll
also
move up.
created the NIH, and we also
Yeah.
created academic institutions, and we also created pharma companies.
Right.
We have to fix all of them, right? So
Yeah.
I take your point. I think it's a very important one. Let's talk about other stakeholders as well.
Okay, so I'll move up the pipeline and say, I don't know where I want to use my chit. But I have to use it in a place that everyone in this room is expecting me to use it, which is we heard in the room earlier with Ben Shapiro talking about these open models. We're here from Stephen Friend, these open models. We funded a lot of this research trying to figure out what's pre-competitive, what's not. We know in the semiconductor industry what worked. We know in Linux to IT what worked. We've got to embrace it. But I have to say, unfortunately, and we can do these proof of concept models like QB3 has, like Despondé has, and it de-risks, it really helps. I mean, we've got the data, pulls it along, but I'm not willing to say fund other than NSF. I'm not willing to say to the NIH, fund these models, because I think the universities are still holding on to IP too much. I mean, you heard it from everybody else in the other room. Yeah. And I know that I'm a broken record on this topic. Mark Kroll sitting right in the front row. And everybody isn't a bad player at all. That is not the case. It's unfortunately a we don't know what we don't know. And you have people making decisions about what to patent and what not to patent that aren't necessarily scientists or industry leaders. And if you turn some of that over to those people, like the QB3 model has done, and like Despondé has done, and like our institute at the University of Kansas has done, such a huge shift happens in having external advisory. And I heard yesterday from Mark that that's what they're doing at UVA. So there's little tweaks that could almost happen to make this work. But I would not encourage the NIH funding these models unless I have guarantees from university leadership that they're going to make these changes.
How do we do that when more than 50% of the R01 grants go to the same people year after year after year?
Well, I'm confident that our friends at Office of Science, Technology, and Policy in the White House, Tom Khalil and friends, Secretary Locke hosted a meeting for us with university presidents from around the country, and John Hennessy from Stanford said, as soon as our breakout session got into action, I founded MIPS before there was a technology licensing policy at Stanford, and I encourage every entrepreneur creating a technology out of Stanford to get out of the university as fast as possible. And so I think that speaks volumes, and I'm quoting. And frankly, philanthropy has learned, and Susan knows this, and we all learned this from Bob Beal and Michael J. Fox and the work that they did, you as funders hold a stick. And damn it, I think the NIH should hold a stick and say, if we're going to give you money, here's what you have to do in return.
So
Do
Susan,
you see us
The nonprofits having a role in doing this?
Yes.
And where would we fit in with what you're doing?
Well, I think you fit in terms of conversations you can have with and I don't mean you because
No,
it's
I
you,
know.
with conversations that you can have with the administration. I mean, they're hearing kind of sole voice from what seems to be Kauffman Foundation complaining, but need instead philanthropists to step up. And frankly, I've asked Bob Beal and I've asked Michael J. Fox and others, and they do, but they're afraid. And have been on record in my previous conferences saying that they have fear of retribution with the universities. Will hold back IP on them. And so the only people that can really do this are patient advocacy groups. For-profit companies look like, you're doing it for reasons that are not altruistic, not civil.
Yes. This is a great segue to get the philanthropic perspective. What are you doing, Susan, or your peers, as you may know it, in terms of trying to fix some of the problems that we've created historically, whether it's better collaboration between the researchers that you're working with, whether it's better collaboration with sister organizations in the field of epilepsy, so you're going from research to translation, working with pharma companies, sort of this whole notion of the ecosystem model. To Lisa's point, you guys have the power of the dollar and the power of the patient's voice to help do things very, very differently. And in fact, Michael J. Fox has proven that it's doable, and many other organizations have proven it's doable. Some insights from you.
Those are models. I mean, we're at a stage, we have the power of the patients. We don't have the power of the dollar quite yet in our community, but we're working on it. But some of the mechanisms that we've set up, in fact, we have one of our new grantees here. We have special awards for innovators. We're trying to make sure that we keep a steady flow of new investigators in the field. So we have Young Investigator Awards. We have a special grant mechanism for multidisciplinary work, so that it needs to be somebody within epilepsy and somebody not in epilepsy, with the attempt of sort of bringing in fresh ideas and possibly new people into the field. And we have, as I mentioned earlier, looking for other opportunities, because there is so much comorbidity, and why recreate the wheel if we can share sort of registries and databases and things like that to collect information. And then again, we're at one end. We keep wanting to look at this continuum of need to get, really. I mean, we even look back to medical school and think, what's going on there, and why are we not sort of getting, and really, every single need along from where we are today to the cures, and trying to find people and things to fill those slots. So, we just adopted an open access policy, so our grantees have to make their data available within a year of publication. That is in the contracts now, and so we're trying to just sort of promote that. Again, we're small scale, but we're trying to sort of model a lot after Michael J. Fox, because we really admire what they've done in their space.
Dennis,
I'd like to go back to the Bob Bell comment. I mean, if you look at Vertex, it's a $9 billion company today. And yes, it's Hep C, but a lot of that valuation comes out of that collaboration.
Yep.
I mean, it's an amazing model that we should really think about replicating.
can you elaborate on the model just for the audience?
Well, I mean, CF gave a bunch of money to a bunch of different companies, and they get some stuff back in return. And, the CF program at Vertex would be on the back burner without that collaboration. And the CF Foundation is going to get some milestones, and they're going to get some royalties, and they're going to be able to fund future work with researchers and stuff. And it just seems to me to be a poster child for a great model for a company that now has a $9 billion market cap. And do you agree with that or not? I mean, it's a hell of a collaboration.
And Mike Milken's Prostate Cancer Foundation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Not a plug for that, but what they did with abiraterone and doing some of the preclinical experiments,
That's right.
validating the new mechanism all the pharmas passed on abiraterone. They said it was a me too anti-androgen.
Yeah,
But there's some smart collaborators with PCF who theorized that no, it's not. There's a new novel mechanism here that's totally distinct from classical anti-androgens. They proved it preclinically. They helped on the phase 1 and phase 2. And most importantly, they created a network of phase 3 investigators, and they ultimately wrote a terrific phase 3 protocol. They started the phase 3, and the phase 3 protocol is bulletproof, and then Johnson & Johnson, to its credit, came in and talk about risk. This is a company that actually put $1 billion down.
900.
Without survival data, and without your classic phase 2 to buy this unencumbered phase 3 asset, and it worked. There was data that came out about 4 months ago that the phase 3 works. So if you take away the PCF, it wasn't just the financial capital, it was the intellectual capital. It was lining up the KOLs so that, and I know this from talking to people at J&J, when they did due diligence on abiraterone at Cougar, they spoke to about 15 or 20 investigators. Well, they all knew the drug, and they were all tied into this network and this system that the PCF built. And that gave them the confidence, or maybe the misconfidence.
No, I've been to 2 meetings with kind of senior people around the industry, and the first one was J&J's an idiot for paying that amount of money. And about a month ago, I was at another meeting, and they said, I can't believe we missed it. Same people. Can I just say one thing, Jim and Alex? The resource allocation question, one of the things I think we do a poor job at is killing things too early. I mean, I think when you talk about resource allocation, I think the venture community has given a lot of money to these companies, and we're unwilling.
The public market's even worse in that respect.
To kill them, yeah, right. The public market's
even
worse.
big pharma's not good at it.
But I can say that's why
Especially.
I like these proof of concept models.
Yeah.
I mean, if we can keep stuff within
right.
the safety of a not-for-profit
Yes,
for
yes.
longer,
Yes.
it de-risks you.
Yes.
But I want to get back to the point you raised about IP. I don't think IP is the problem. In fact, in some ways, IP is what creates the opportunity for funding of these things, because in the absence of exclusivity, you're not going to fund them very far along. I think it's actually academic competitiveness that's the problem, and people don't want to talk about it.
No, you're right.
And so, the thing that's hard about creating consortia and putting everybody's name on a paper doesn't give you quite as much status in the academic community as having kept that in your own lab and among a smaller group of co-investigators.
Which
And I think this
again-
goes to the point of the incentives as well. I mean, there's systematic and systemic incentives that have been around that enable this kind of behavior continued even up until today. I want to ask a question around outcome measures and new ways of looking or thinking about ROI moving forward across the value chain from discovery through approval. What are some new ways for us to think about both the metrics and incentives at each stage that enable better transparency, these collaborative models that you're talking about, de-risking by working with philanthropic groups through proof of concept? How do we, as venture capitalists, as public officials, as academics, think about the measures and the outcomes that we should be thinking about that we think will start to bring us together, and stop talking about what exists in the past. We know that there are systematic issues vis-a-vis the past. What are the things that we should start talking about and the measures that we should start collecting data around to do some of the things that you're saying and bring them to scale? Mark, do you want to start?
Is Howard Phillip here? I don't know if I saw him. He was here yesterday. I like how he measures his success. The Lauder family, I think, has given him about $50 million, and his organization is called the Institute for the Study of Aging. And they get in and invest at the highest risk area, kind of preclinical stuff that nobody would touch. I suspect most VCs wouldn't touch it. Certainly pharmas and biotechs wouldn't touch it. And how do they measure success? They put $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 million in, and they measure success by how much more money they can raise. So if they put $2 million in and they can create enough value that the next round is 5 and the next round is 15, and then there's a pharma partner at 50, they call that a success. Now, it gets into the fact that, there's the Lauder family, it's their money, but I actually think that that's a metric that's actually easy and tangible. And while it's unclear if any of the stuff they have financed will ultimately get to market, they actually have taken stuff now to phase 3 that's super high risk, that guaranteed would have died in academia. And the lead program came out of Oklahoma. So they actually went to a state that's not known for biotech, not known for IP lawyers, not known for having the infrastructure to start companies, and they actually, in Astellas, and so I call that a major success in terms of, translational. Now, whether it works in man is an act of God. You can't tell. As long as you design a good phase 3, you just hope. But the fact that it got to phase 3, the fact that they moved something that would never have been financed into phase 3, I think is a major accomplishment. And again, that metric of would other people embrace it was relatively simple. It wasn't, Dennis is in a much stricter world where he has to actually show return of capital.
Right.
But this was basically, can you rate, with Vertex, I suspect that if you look at that model, the fact that Vertex and a lot of the CF programs, have had increased funding, again, I think is at least an easy measure to go to your stakeholders and say, we've done it.
So Lisa's dollars growing, siloed intellectual property growing, siloed creation of knowledge growing, and yet productivity.
All bad metrics, yes.
And yet productivity declining. How do we rethink this?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I don't have a good answer. We're starting a program this year with the OECD that we're calling Measuring Intangibles, because right now we measure what we can see. And so all anybody measures is, unfortunately, from especially a university or an NIH perspective, we can measure cures, but that is too far away for any political cycle or funder. And so all they measure is what they can see under the light post, which is IP or articles. And I think we're already seeing in China this crazy thing going on with measuring articles and counting, and it's insane. And universities are getting funded that way. So I'm glad to see someone else going a wrong direction. But I think ultimately, I really love this thought, even as it relates to, because we believe this in our own foundation, as we try to be entrepreneurial, even though we're not-for-profit, is at the end of the day, it's only everybody else's money coming in and solving problems that you're going to prove, whether you have anything any good. It's kind of like the customer. If you can have one, you are good. And so I think ultimately at the end of the day, that's the only metric. But what I do know is that I'm really concerned about all the metrics that we have. And so we have to super question ourselves about these silos and about using IP as a metric, or the worst case scenario with universities using licensing revenue as a metric,
Right.
which I think they're getting a lot better about. I don't have good answers.
Can I simplify the metric? People give us $1 and they want $1.50 back, and we give them back 70 cents.
Yeah.
That's a metric.
Yep.
Susan, I'm getting the 2-minute warning from there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, keep going.
How do you think about success metrics in your field and with philanthropic dollars?
I mean, I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer to that either. I mean, ideally, our long-term goal is to be put out of business because we've cured this disease. Within our domain, within epilepsy, we have certain things that we measure, which would be, dollars raised, because, just the private dollars have been so poor in this field. Number of collaborative efforts that we see going on, number of new investigators brought into the field. Those are wholly unsatisfying answers, particularly to our donors who are mostly family members, because or number of publications or R01 grants that come out of it. So we grapple with this a lot. There's that big end goal, and then in between there are steps, but communicating that and the importance of that to people who are suffering is really difficult. But I'm learning a lot of, we need to get sort of past where we are and be looking longer term down it.
And Dennis, how do you unpack the 70 cents? I mean,
Well, I think there's two ways that work. One is if Lisa would invest with us. Or two, Prospect Ventures or
If you
Domain
didn't have 70
Associates
cents, we might.
acquire us. But I will say one thing we haven't talked about today. I don't know if you guys would agree with it, but this industry's going down by half.
No question.
by half. And, that might help on the resource allocation question, but it's going to change.
Yep.
The next
Yeah.
5 years, it's going to change.
So can I have maybe a better answer that you might like for the metric?
No, I'd like an answer that said you invested our fund.
No, but I think the answer to what are the metrics, one of the easy answers is we start seeing new business models.
See, new business model.
I mean, that is really what we need,
Yeah.
Right.
is new business models, for-profit business models.
Yes.
But I think coming back to what Mark said, the way we get our companies bought at a good price by Pfizer, and by the way, that's the only way you make money.
Yeah.
You don't make money taking companies public.
Yeah.
Right.
Not anymore, right?
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Not in the last 10 years. Okay. So this whole mythology that we're just building companies that are going to be big, durable, standalone companies in the public markets, and it's gone. It's out the window. So how do we get you to buy us before $100 million has been invested or more? Is reduce the regulatory risk.
Right.
Because if you could buy us at the end of phase 2 with great confidence that when you invested in phase $3, you were going to be successful, obviously failure can happen for, biology reasons, medical reasons, but it shouldn't happen for regulatory reasons.
Right. Although we do have to increase tremendously the flow of foundational knowledge that's happening in early science today, which is precluding us from really getting the type of advances that I think we can be getting.
Alex, I'd argue if the FDA was predictable, the IPO market might open up again.
I've done
That was good.
I've done a terrible job of managing the time with this panel, but I hope you enjoyed the vast topics that we covered here. We're all around here for a few minutes, so happy to have a conversation with you. Thank you very much.